I cleared my late husband's $185,000 gambling debts to rescue my son's marriage. I signed over my Vermont farmhouse so his family could rebuild their lives. The following morning, they sold everything and vanished to Portugal. My daughter-in-law's farewell message read, "Pathetic old hag, you disgust me. Thank God we are rid of you. Share this story if you have ever been betrayed by family. And tell me which state you are reading from, so I can see how far this truth has traveled." The phone call arrived on a drizzly Wednesday afternoon, while I was preserving the last of my apple harvest. David's voice carried a desperation I had never heard before, even during his teenage years when crisis seemed to be his natural state. At 71, I believed I had witnessed every possible variation of my son's emotional range. But this was different. This was the sound of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss. "Mother, I need to come see you immediately. Can you clear your schedule? This cannot wait another day." I set down my paring knife, my weathered hands trembling slightly from arthritis that had worsened since losing Robert 2 years earlier. "Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right with Stephanie and the children?" The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Then came a sound that might have been a suppressed sob. "No, Mother. Nothing is all right. Nothing has been all right for months." David arrived 45 minutes later, with Stephanie trailing behind him like an elegant shadow. My daughter-in-law had always possessed that particular type of beauty that required maintenance, the kind of woman who never appeared in public without perfect makeup and coordinated accessories. Today, she looked different somehow. There was something calculating in her steel blue eyes, something that made my chest tighten with inexplicable unease. "Hello, Margaret," Stephanie said, her voice honey-smooth, but carrying an undertone I couldn't quite identify. She pressed her lips to my cheek in a gesture that felt more performative than affectionate, and I caught the scent of expensive French perfume that seemed too heavy for an afternoon visit. David couldn't maintain eye contact. He collapsed into the kitchen chair he had occupied countless times during childhood, the same Windsor chair where he had confessed to breaking windows and failing tests. His usually crisp button-down shirt was wrinkled. His normally neat hair disheveled, and dark shadows ringed his eyes like bruises. "Tell me what is happening," I said, pouring coffee into my grandmother's china cups, the delicate rose-patterned set I reserved for special occasions, though this visit felt anything but celebratory. "We are facing financial catastrophe." "Mother," David said, his voice cracking like adolescence, "I made some terrible investment decisions last year, really catastrophic ones. The bank is threatening foreclosure on our house, and the attorneys are saying we could lose absolutely everything we have worked for." My heart contracted painfully. David was my only child. My entire world since Robert's sudden heart attack had left me alone on this rural Vermont property. The thought of him struggling, of my precious grandchildren, 8-year-old Madison and 6-year-old Tyler potentially becoming homeless, was absolutely unbearable. "How much money are we discussing?" I asked quietly, mentally calculating the contents of my savings account. Stephanie leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped elegantly around the delicate coffee cup. Her wedding ring caught the afternoon light streaming through my kitchen window, the diamond David had worked double shifts to afford when they were young and genuinely in love. $185,000. That is the minimum we need to stop the foreclosure proceedings and settle the most urgent debts before they destroy David's credit permanently. The figure hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath temporarily. It represented virtually everything I possessed, money accumulated through 43 years of marriage, supplemented by Robert's modest life insurance policy and the small pension from his decades managing the local grain elevator. "Mother, I realize it is an enormous amount," David said, finally meeting my eyes. His gaze was red-rimmed and pleading, carrying the same desperate quality I remembered from his childhood, when he had broken something valuable and feared disappointing us. "But I honestly don't know where else to turn. The children keep asking why we are suddenly looking at apartments in town, and I cannot bear to explain that we might end up in some terrible shelter situation." Stephanie's hand moved to David's shoulder in what appeared to be a supportive gesture, though something about the movement felt rehearsed, almost theatrical. We have exhausted every other possible option. Margaret. David's too proud to ask family for help, but I convinced him that families support each other during crises. That is what real families do. There was something in her delivery that bothered me, though I couldn't articulate exactly what felt wrong. I pushed the uncomfortable feeling aside, focusing instead on my son's obvious distress and my grandchildren's welfare. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford when their futures hung in the balance. What about housing arrangements? I heard myself asking. Even if we resolve this immediate financial crisis, where will you live while rebuilding your stability? David and Stephanie exchanged a look that lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long, communicating something I couldn't decipher. We were hoping, David said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care, that perhaps we could stay here with you temporarily, just until we regain our financial footing and find appropriate permanent housing. My farmhouse sat on 12 acres of Vermont countryside that Robert and I had purchased as newlyweds with dreams of raising a large family. The 4-bedroom colonial had proven too large for just the 3 of us. And now, with David grown and Robert gone, it felt cavernous and lonely. The mortgage had been satisfied 15 years earlier. The children absolutely adore this property, Stephanie added, her voice warming considerably. They have such wonderful memories of visiting Grandma Margaret here. It would provide them with stability and continuity during this difficult transition period. I studied my son's face, seeing the frightened little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, the teenager who had practiced graduation speeches in front of my bedroom mirror, the young man who had cried when his father died. He didn't deserve to suffer because of financial mistakes, and my grandchildren certainly didn't deserve to pay for their father's poor judgment. All right, I said quietly. I will provide the money, and you can move in here. We will make the living arrangements work somehow. David's head snapped up like he had been struck by lightning. The relief that flooded his features was instantaneous and overwhelming, transforming his entire appearance in seconds. Mother, I cannot believe thank you. Thank you so incredibly much. You have literally saved our lives. He pushed back from the table and enveloped me in an embrace so tight I could barely breathe. Over his shoulder, I glimpsed Stephanie's expression for just a moment before she rearranged her features into an appropriate mask of gratitude. What I saw in that unguarded instant made my blood run cold. It wasn't relief or appreciation or even simple gratitude. It was satisfaction, pure, calculating. Predatory satisfaction, like a cat that had successfully cornered its prey. But David was holding me, weeping into my shoulder the way he had as a small child. And I told myself I was imagining things. Stress and desperation could make anyone's facial expressions appear strange and unnatural. We will need to move quickly on this, Stephanie said, her voice suddenly crisp and businesslike. The foreclosure timeline is extremely aggressive, and every day we delay makes the situation more precarious. The following week passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and financial transactions that left me feeling disoriented and exhausted. I liquidated my entire savings account, watching 4 decades of careful accumulation disappear with a few signatures and electronic transfers. The bank manager, Patricia Williams, who had handled my accounts for more than 20 years, looked genuinely concerned as I completed the withdrawal paperwork. Are you absolutely certain about this decision, Margaret? This represents your entire financial safety net. Once this money is gone, you will be living entirely on Social Security. It is for my family, I said firmly, though my hands trembled as I signed the withdrawal authorization. Sometimes family obligations require personal sacrifice. The property transfer proved more complicated and emotionally challenging. My attorney, James Morrison, who had handled Robert's estate planning and will, seemed genuinely troubled by my decision. Margaret, I must ask you to reconsider this arrangement. Signing over complete ownership of your property leaves you extremely vulnerable. We could establish a more protective legal structure, perhaps shared ownership or a life estate that guarantees your housing security. James, I interrupted, trying to project more confidence than I actually felt. My son needs stability for his family. My grandchildren need a secure home environment. This is absolutely the right decision. David appeared uncomfortable with the attorney's probing questions, shifting nervously in his chair and avoiding direct eye contact with both of us. Stephanie, however, maintained her gracious charm throughout the entire process. Mr. Morrison, we completely understand and appreciate your concern for Margaret's welfare. That is precisely why we want this to be a true family home where we can all care for each other properly. But when James stepped out to prepare copies of the documents, I overheard Stephanie whisper urgently to David, "The sooner we finalize this paperwork, the better, before she reconsiders or changes her mind about anything." The comment sent an icy chill down my spine, but when I looked directly at her, she was smiling warmly at me with apparent sincerity. "I was just telling David how grateful we are for your generosity, Margaret. The children are absolutely thrilled about living with Grandma Margaret full-time." I forced myself to smile in response, pushing down the growing unease that seemed to expand in my chest like a cold fog. The day we completed all the legal paperwork, David embraced me again with obvious relief and gratitude. "Mother, you have literally saved our entire family. I promise we will make this arrangement work beautifully. We will take excellent care of you too." Stephanie nodded enthusiastically, her perfectly applied lipstick gleaming under the office fluorescent lights. "Absolutely. We are truly a family now, all living under one roof. It is going to be absolutely perfect." As I watched them drive away in their late model SUV to collect their belongings from their threatened home, I stood in the doorway of what was legally no longer my property, feeling strangely hollow and disconnected. I had given them everything: my entire life savings, my home, my financial security, my independence. But instead of experiencing the warm satisfaction that should accompany helping family, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread settling over me like a heavy blanket. That evening, I sat in Robert's favorite recliner, surrounded by the living room where we had celebrated countless Christmases and birthday parties, where David had taken his first tentative steps, where we had watched him graduate from high school and college. Tomorrow, this space would be filled with moving boxes and new furniture arrangements, new household rules and different daily rhythms. I told myself I was being unnecessarily anxious. This was what families did for each other during crises. This was love manifested through action rather than mere words. But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I couldn't shake the image of Stephanie's satisfied expression or the cold calculation I had glimpsed in her eyes when she thought I wasn't observing her carefully. I woke to absolute silence on a Monday morning that felt wrong in every possible way. After 3 weeks of sharing my home with David's family, the quiet felt ominous and unnatural. There should have been sounds of Madison preparing for school, Tyler's morning cartoons echoing from the living room, Stephanie's elaborate coffee routine creating familiar kitchen noises. Instead, there was nothing but an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl with apprehension. I descended the stairs in my robe, calling softly, "David, Stephanie, children?" My voice echoed through the empty hallway, answered only by the steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock Robert had inherited from his father. The living room appeared different, cleaner, but too clean, unnaturally spotless. The family photographs that had cluttered every surface for decades had vanished. Stephanie's decorative accessories, which had gradually appeared throughout the house during their stay, were nowhere to be seen. Even the children's school backpacks, which had lived by the front door, had disappeared completely. My hands began shaking uncontrollably. I rushed to the kitchen, desperately hoping to find some explanation, some reassuring note about an early morning emergency or unexpected travel plans. The granite countertop was completely bare except for a single piece of white paper folded precisely in half. My name was written across it in Stephanie's distinctive handwriting, sharp, angular letters that somehow looked aggressive even in pencil. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper. The words struck me like physical blows. "Margaret, thanks for everything. We sold the house yesterday, and we are starting completely fresh in Portugal. Don't bother trying to find us, P.S. Pathetic old hag. You disgust me. Thank God we are rid of you. I read the message 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated my consciousness. They had sold the house, my house, the property I had transferred to help them avoid foreclosure, to keep our family together and secure. And they had sold it without informing me, without even attempting to say goodbye properly. The cruelty of that postscript pathetic old hag. You disgust me was so unexpected and vicious that I actually gasped aloud. This wasn't simply abandonment. This was deliberate, calculated humiliation designed to maximize emotional damage. I collapsed into the kitchen chair where David had sat crying just 1 month earlier, begging desperately for my help and promising eternal gratitude. The same chair where I had made the decision to sacrifice everything for his welfare. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I was now effectively homeless in what had been my own property for 37 years. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. Property sale completed successfully. New owners take possession Wednesday. You must vacate by Tuesday evening. Today was Monday morning. The reality crashed over me in successive waves of horror. I had no money remaining. I had given every penny to David. I had no legal claim to housing. He had sold the property without my knowledge. I had nowhere to go and less than 48 hours to develop a survival plan. I attempted calling David's cell phone number. The line was disconnected. Stephanie's phone went directly to a voicemail system that was completely full. Their social media accounts had vanished overnight, deleted as if they had never existed. They hadn't simply abandoned me. They would systematically erase every trace of their connection to me, covering their tracks like professional criminals planning an international escape. I remained seated at that kitchen table for several hours, clutching Stephanie's cruel note in my hands, struggling to comprehend how I had been so completely and thoroughly deceived. Every conversation, every expression of gratitude, every promise about caring for me in return, all of it had been elaborate, lies performed with Academy Award-level conviction. The worst part wasn't even the money or the house. Devastating as those losses were, it was the realization that my son, the baby I had nursed through countless illnesses, the boy I had cheered at every baseball game, the man I had believed I knew intimately had orchestrated this betrayal. With cold-blooded calculation, he had looked directly into my eyes and lied with such apparent sincerity that I had never suspected deception for even a moment. Around noon, my neighbor Helen Peterson knocked on the front door. I could see her through the window, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the concerned expression she typically reserved for funeral visits. "Margaret," I heard voices very early this morning. "Saw a large moving truck in your driveway. Is everything all right over here?" A moving truck? They had hired professional movers, while I slept peacefully upstairs, quietly and efficiently packing their entire lives before disappearing like morning mist. I opened the door, still clutching Stephanie's hateful note in my trembling hand. Helen took one look at my face and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "Oh, honey, what in the world has happened here?" The story emerged in broken, disjointed pieces. Helen's facial expression shifted from concern to shock to outrage as I explained about the money, the property transfer, and the overnight disappearance. "That is fraud," she said flatly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "You need to call the police immediately." But what crime had they actually committed that I could prove? I would voluntarily provided the money and willingly signed over the house deed. They had never made legally binding promises about letting me remain in the house permanently. The emotional cruelty was devastating, but it probably wasn't criminal. "What are you going to do now?" Helen asked gently, settling beside me on the living room sofa. Honestly, I had no idea. At 71, with no savings and no home, my options were terrifyingly limited. I could probably afford a cheap motel room for a few weeks. But after that? What? Senior housing facilities had waiting lists stretching months or even years. My Social Security barely covered basic living expenses, let alone rent in today's inflated market. I might need to contact Catholic charities, I admitted, the words tasting bitter and shameful in my mouth. See if they have any emergency housing programs for displaced seniors. Helen's eyes filled with tears of sympathy and rage. Margaret, you can stay with us while you figure this out. It is not much space, but absolutely no one should have to face this kind of betrayal alone. No, I said quickly, though my voice wavered with emotion. I will not impose on your family. You have enough responsibilities without adding my problems. But her kindness, offered so freely after my own family's calculated cruelty, nearly broke my emotional control completely. I excused myself to the bathroom and sobbed until my chest ached with physical pain. That afternoon, I began packing my personal belongings into the old suitcases stored in the attic since our last vacation years earlier. 43 years of marriage and independent life reduced to a few bags that would fit in my aging Honda Civic. I found myself touching objects I had always taken for granted. Robert's reading glasses, still resting on his nightstand. The handmade quilt my mother had created for our wedding. Photographs documenting David's entire childhood from first steps to college graduation. How had that sweet, innocent little boy evolved into someone capable of such heartless betrayal against his own mother? While folding Robert's favorite cardigan sweater, I discovered something that made my blood pressure spike dangerously. A real estate listing forwarded to my email, probably from Helen trying to be helpful. It was my farmhouse, described in glowing professional terms, charming colonial on 12 pristine acres, with original hardwood floors, vintage fixtures, and stunning mountain views. The asking price was $425,000. I stared at that number until my vision blurred with tears. They had sold my home for more than twice what I had given them to resolve their supposed financial crisis. After allegedly paying off their debts, they had walked away with a substantial fortune, my fortune built through decades of careful saving and responsible financial management. But there was something else in the property listing that made my heart race with horrible realization. In the disclosure section, buried among legal technicalities, was a note about ongoing environmental assessments and potential groundwater contamination issues currently under professional investigation. Groundwater contamination. Environmental problems. My memory flashed back 15 years to when Robert and I had discovered the old buried oil tank on our property. The environmental testing had revealed minor soil contamination that would eventually require expensive remediation, but the situation wasn't immediately dangerous. We would simply avoided using well water and connected to the municipal water system, hoping future owners would deal with the cleanup costs when we eventually sold the property. David knew about the contamination issue. He had been with us when the environmental engineer delivered his assessment. He had seen the paperwork, heard the warnings about eventual cleanup requirements and potential liability issues. So when I had transferred the house to them, they had inherited not just valuable property, but also a significant environmental liability that I had never disclosed to potential buyers. Suddenly, Stephanie's satisfied expression made perfect sense. They hadn't just stolen from me, they would deliberately stuck me with a worthless property while they escaped with my money, knowing that environmental problems would eventually surface. Except they hadn't escaped quickly enough. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number, but something compelled me to answer. Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh and Associates Real Estate. I am representing the buyers of your former property at 1247 Mountain View Road. There has been a significant development regarding the environmental inspection. I gripped the phone tighter, hardly daring to breathe. What kind of development, madam? It appears there are serious groundwater contamination issues that weren't properly disclosed during the sale. The new owners are facing potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in mandatory cleanup costs, and they are consulting attorneys about legal action against the sellers. My mouth went completely dry. Legal action. Yes, madam. Property fraud involving environmental hazards is an extremely serious matter, especially when it involves deliberately concealing known contamination. Do you happen to know how we might contact David Morrison and his wife? They seem to have disappeared completely, and we have urgent legal papers that need to be served. I looked down at Stephanie's cruel note, at the words "pathetic old hag. You disgust me," and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. For the first time since discovering that note, I smiled genuinely. "I am terribly sorry," I said calmly, "but I have absolutely no idea where they might be located." The Pine Valley Senior Living Facility smelled perpetually of industrial disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. My efficiency apartment contained exactly 350 square feet of beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and furniture that had seen better decades. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, reviewing the stack of legal documents that had been delivered that morning by certified mail. 6 weeks had passed since I had moved out of my farmhouse. 6 weeks of sleeping in this institutional environment, while lawyers, environmental agencies, and real estate professionals called daily with increasingly urgent questions about David and Stephanie's whereabouts. The papers spread across my small table represented multiple lawsuits. The buyers were suing for environmental fraud. The EPA was launching an investigation into illegal contamination concealment. The real estate agents were threatening litigation against everyone involved in the property transaction. And I sat trapped in the middle of this legal maelstrom, with nowhere to hide and no resources to defend myself. I had spent the morning at the Social Security Administration office, trying to understand my severely limited options. The caseworker, a weary-looking woman named Patricia, had reviewed my file with professional sympathy that somehow made everything worse. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to be completely honest with you. Your monthly benefit of $1,247 will not cover much beyond basic survival expenses. Have you considered applying for subsidized housing assistance? What is the current waiting list?" I had asked, though I already suspected the answer would be devastating. For seniors in this area, approximately 2 to 3 years. 3 years. At 71, with my health already deteriorating under stress, 3 years felt like an eternity of institutional living. The isolation was perhaps the worst aspect of my situation. David had been my primary connection to the wider world beyond my rural community. His children had been my main source of joy and purpose, my motivation for getting up each morning. Now they were gone, vanished as if they had never existed. I found myself wondering whether Madison and Tyler even understood what their parents had done, whether they thought I would simply chosen to disappear from their lives without explanation. Helen Peterson still called regularly, checking on me with persistent kindness that made my throat tighten with gratitude. She had offered repeatedly to let me stay with her family. But I couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden to people who had already shown me more genuine care than my own family. The depression crept in gradually, like floodwater rising in a basement. Some mornings, I couldn't identify a single reason to leave my narrow bed. The kitchenette mocked me with its single burner and mini refrigerator, a cruel reminder of the spacious kitchen where I had prepared Sunday dinners for my family. I had started talking to Robert's photograph, propped beside my bed among the few possessions I had managed to salvage. "I really failed this time," I told his smiling face during a particularly dark evening. "You always warned me about trusting too easily. You were absolutely right about that." The silence that answered me felt more painful than any argument we had ever had during 43 years of marriage. I tried obsessively to reconstruct the warning signs I had missed, the red flags I had chosen to ignore because I wanted to believe in my son's love and honesty. Stephanie's constant comments about the farmhouse being too large for me. David's sudden interest in my financial situation after years of minimal contact. The way they had rushed through paperwork, discouraging me from having independent legal counsel review everything. How had I been so catastrophically blind to their deception? The phone rang one afternoon, startling me from my spiral of self-recrimination. I almost didn't answer, since most calls involved lawyers or investigators trying to locate David. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Rodriguez, with the State Police Fraud Unit. I was hoping we could schedule a time to meet and discuss your situation." My blood turned to ice water. "What exactly do you want to discuss?" "The property transfer and subsequent sale that occurred at 1247 Mountain View Road. We have opened a formal investigation based on complaints from the current property owners and some concerning irregularities we have discovered. I haven't committed any crimes," I said quickly, though my voice trembled with anxiety. No, madam, we don't believe you have. But we need to understand the complete scope of what happened here. There are some serious discrepancies in the paperwork that suggest this wasn't a standard family property transfer. Discrepancies, the word echoed in my mind long after I ended the call. What had David and Stephanie done beyond stealing my money and house? What other laws had they violated while using me as their unwitting accomplice? That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay on the narrow mattress, listening to my neighbor's television, bleeding through paper-thin walls, trying to remember exactly what David had told me about his supposed debts and foreclosure crisis. The more I reconstructed our conversations, the more inconsistencies I discovered. He had claimed his house was in immediate foreclosure. But I had never seen official paperwork. He had mentioned lawyers and collection agencies, but he had never provided names or contact information. He had painted such a convincing picture of financial catastrophe that I had handed over my life savings without requesting verification of any kind. What if the entire debt crisis had been fabricated? What if they would simply wanted my money and property, manufacturing an elaborate emergency to manipulate my maternal instincts? The possibility was so devastating that I actually felt physically nauseated. If David had never been in genuine financial trouble, if this had been an elaborate confidence game from the beginning, then my sacrifice had been meaningless, worse than meaningless. It would mean I had been played for a complete fool by people who had studied my weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. I got up and made chamomile tea with shaking hands, then sat at the tiny table beside my window. Outside, the parking lot was empty, except for a few cars belonging to other residents who, like me, had nowhere else to go. My reflection stared back from the dark glass, a pale, thin woman who looked significantly older than her 71 years. The person in the window bore little resemblance to the confident farm wife I had been just 2 months earlier, when I had owned property and possessed savings and believed I had a loving family. That woman had been naive, perhaps, but she would also felt genuinely loved and valued. Or so she had believed. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contact list, searching for someone to call for emotional support. The list was pitifully short, mostly businesses and casual acquaintances rather than genuine friends. Robert and I had been comfortable homebodies, content with each other's company and our small rural community. David and his family had represented our connection to the future, our bridge to the next generation. Without them, I was truly and completely alone. The next morning brought another phone call from Detective Rodriguez, this time with information rather than questions. "Mrs. Morrison, we have located your son and daughter-in-law. They are currently in Portugal, where they have been living for approximately 6 weeks. Portugal. While I was sleeping on an institutional mattress and worrying about how to afford groceries, they were enjoying European wine and ocean views purchased with money that had been mine for decades. We are working with international authorities to determine our options for extradition and asset recovery." The detective continued, "Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you some detailed questions about the condition of your property when you transferred ownership. The buyers are claiming that significant environmental contamination was deliberately concealed during the sale." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of what I was about to admit. I knew about the groundwater contamination issues. My husband and I discovered them years ago. "You were aware of contamination? We had had environmental testing done. There was an old buried oil tank that had leaked into the soil. We never remediated it because the cleanup costs were prohibitive." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Morrison, did you disclose these issues to your son when you transferred the property?" "No," I said quietly. "I assumed they would be living there permanently. I never imagined they would sell it to unsuspecting buyers." Another pause, even longer. "Madam, I think you should speak with an attorney immediately. It is possible that you are a victim of elder abuse and fraud rather than a conspirator. But the legal situation is extremely complex, and you need professional representation." A victim, the label should have provided some comfort, but instead it only reinforced how completely my life had been destroyed by people I had trusted unconditionally. After ending the call, I sat in my institutional chair and watched the world continue outside my window. Other people living normal lives, going to work, visiting family, secure in their homes and relationships. I envied them their certainty, their faith in the people they loved most. But as the day progressed, something began to shift inside me. The despair remained, but underneath it, I felt the first stirrings of something else entirely. Anger. David and Stephanie were living in Portuguese luxury on my money, probably laughing about the pathetic old hag they had left behind to face the consequences of their criminal behavior. They believed they had won completely, that they had gotten away with perfect crimes. They had no comprehension of what they would actually done to themselves by underestimating a farm woman who had survived 7 decades of challenges. The law office of Anderson and Associates occupied a modest suite in a converted Victorian house downtown. Nothing like the corporate glass towers I had seen in movies, but the wooden floors and vintage fixtures felt more trustworthy somehow. Sarah Anderson was younger than I had expected, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back practically and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair across from her cluttered desk. "Detective Rodriguez explained the basics of your situation. I have to say, this represents one of the most complex elder abuse cases I have encountered." Elder abuse? The term felt strange applied to my situation, though I was beginning to understand its accuracy. "I want to be completely transparent with you," Sarah continued, opening a thick file folder. "I am accepting this case on a contingency basis because I believe you have been systematically victimized. But the legal landscape here is quite complicated." Over the next hour, she explained the maze of state and federal laws that David and Stephanie had potentially violated: elder financial abuse, property fraud, environmental contamination concealment, possible wire fraud if they had used electronic communications in their scheme. "The encouraging news," Sarah said, "is that the property buyers aren't pursuing legal action against you personally. Their insurance company has determined that you are likely an unwitting victim rather than a willing participant in the fraud." I felt some tension leave my shoulders for the first time in weeks. "What is the discouraging news? Recovering your financial losses will be challenging, even if we can prove systematic fraud. Your son and daughter-in-law appear to have moved most of the stolen money offshore, probably into Portuguese bank accounts." She pulled out an official document bearing impressive seals and signatures. "However, there has been a significant development that works in our favor. Portuguese authorities have frozen several bank accounts linked to your son and his wife, pending investigation of the source of their funds." My heart jumped with something that might have been hope. Why would they do that? Because they made a critical error when purchasing property in Portugal. They had to declare the source of their funding to Portuguese banking authorities. They claimed the money came from the legitimate sale of inherited family property. Sarah leaned forward, her expression growing more animated. "But when the Portuguese bank conducted their required due diligence investigation, they discovered the environmental contamination issues and the ongoing fraud investigation here in Vermont. So they are in trouble there as well?" "More than trouble. Portugal has extremely strict laws regarding foreign nationals bringing potentially fraudulent money into their country. They don't want to become a haven for international financial criminals." Sarah showed me a news article on her tablet from a Portuguese English-language newspaper. The headline read, "American couple detained in financial fraud investigation." Below was a photograph of David and Stephanie being escorted from what appeared to be a police station, both in handcuffs. Seeing my son in restraints should have broken my heart. Despite everything, he was still the little boy I had raised and loved for 38 years. But all I felt was cold, satisfying vindication. They looked terrified and disheveled. Nothing like the confident criminals who had vanished with my life savings while leaving me homeless. "There is something else you should know," Sarah said, pulling my attention back to our conversation. "The environmental contamination at your former property is significantly worse than anyone initially realized." She handed me an engineering report commissioned by the new owner's insurance company. I struggled to understand the technical language and scientific assessments. "What does this mean in practical terms?" It means your farmhouse is essentially uninhabitable without massive environmental remediation. The contamination has spread much further than originally detected. Cleanup costs are estimated at over $300,000 more than the property's current market value. I stared at the report, remembering Robert's worried expression 15 years earlier when we had first discovered the buried oil tank. We had known it was problematic, but not catastrophically so. The crucial detail here is the timeline, Sarah continued. According to this report, the contamination spread accelerated dramatically in the past 5 years, suggesting that someone may have disturbed the original contamination site. Someone disturbed it? Think about it chronologically. Your son and daughter-in-law were living in that house, aware of the environmental issues. Instead of disclosing the problems to you or working together on remediation, they waited until the situation became your legal liability, then disappeared with your money while leaving you responsible for worthless, contaminated property. The calculated cruelty took my breath away. This hadn't been a desperate act by people facing genuine crisis. This had been a long-term plan to defraud me while simultaneously destroying my financial security. There is more evidence, Sarah said gently. We have been investigating your son's financial history, the debts he claimed, the foreclosure proceedings he described. There is no documentation for any of it. The room seemed to spin slightly. None of it was real. None of it. Based on our investigation, David and Stephanie have been financially stable for years. They both maintained steady employment, possessed adequate savings, and had no significant debts beyond typical household expenses. The betrayal cut deeper than I had thought possible. Every tear David had shed in my kitchen, every desperate plea for maternal rescue, every promise about repaying my generosity, all of it had been elaborate theater performed to manipulate my emotions. Why? I whispered. Why would they systematically destroy their own mother? Sarah's expression softened with genuine sympathy. From what we can determine, they had been planning to emigrate to Portugal for quite some time. They needed substantial liquid capital to purchase property abroad and establish themselves financially. Your savings account and real estate equity represented an accessible source of funding. Accessible, I repeated bitterly. I am sorry. I realize how painful this must be to hear and process. I looked out her office window at the busy street below, watching ordinary people navigate their daily lives with intact families and normal concerns. What happens now? Now we have several options available to us. Portuguese authorities are willing to cooperate with our investigation if your son and daughter-in-law agree to make complete restitution. They want this resolved quickly to avoid creating an international diplomatic incident. Sarah handed me another document, labeled Settlement Proposal. If they refuse to negotiate, they face criminal prosecution in Portugal, which could result in years of imprisonment and complete forfeiture of all their assets. Either way, you are likely to recover the majority of your financial losses, plus additional damages for elder abuse and emotional distress. I looked at the numbers on the settlement proposal. It wasn't everything I had lost, but it was enough to restore my independence and financial security. There is one important caveat, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. The settlement would require your signature on a non-disclosure agreement. You wouldn't be able to discuss the details of their crimes publicly. They want to purchase my silence. Essentially, yes. The question is whether that is acceptable to you under these circumstances. I thought about Stephanie's cruel note, about the weeks I had spent in institutional housing, wondering if I would die alone and forgotten. I thought about the fear and desperation they had inflicted, the way they had made me question my own judgment and self-worth. Money could restore my financial security, but it couldn't erase the emotional trauma they would deliberately cause. I need time to consider this carefully, I said finally. Sarah nodded understanding. Take the time you need, but don't delay too long. Portuguese authorities will not hold them indefinitely, and if they are released before we resolve this, recovering anything becomes exponentially more difficult. That evening, back in my efficiency apartment, I sat with the settlement documents spread across my small table. The financial terms were generous, more than enough to purchase a comfortable small house, rebuild my savings, and live independently for the remainder of my life. But something about the non-disclosure clause bothered me profoundly. It felt like they were attempting to erase their crimes, to purchase the right to never be held publicly accountable for their systematic abuse. My phone rang with Helen's weekly check-in call. "How are you managing, dear?" I explained about the settlement offer, about David and Stephanie's arrest in Portugal, about the possibility of recovering my stolen money. "That is wonderful news," she exclaimed. "You must feel incredibly relieved." "I am relieved," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "But something feels unfinished." "What do you mean?" "It feels like they are escaping real consequences. They pay some money, sign some papers, and then resume their lives while I try to rebuild mine from nothing." Helen was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, sometimes the best revenge is simply surviving and thriving, despite what they did to you." She was right, of course. But as I looked at Robert's photograph beside my narrow bed, I couldn't escape the feeling that accepting the settlement would represent another form of defeat. They thought they understood me, believed I was just a weak-old woman they could exploit and discard without consequences. They had no comprehension of the strength they had awakened when they decided to systematically destroy my life. Maybe it was time to show them exactly who they were really dealing with. I didn't sign the settlement papers that night. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called in sick to my volunteer work at the community center and spent the entire day researching Portuguese immigration and financial laws. If David and Stephanie believed they could buy their way out of this situation, they were about to discover how wrong they were about everything. The more I investigated Portuguese regulations regarding foreign property ownership, the more fascinating the situation became. The country had implemented increasingly strict oversight after several high-profile cases involving Americans using fraudulent funds to purchase real estate. What David and Stephanie had stumbled into wasn't merely a civil dispute. It was a criminal investigation that could result in permanent deportation and lifetime bans from re-entering European Union countries. But there was something else. Something that made my pulse quicken when I fully grasped its implications. I called Sarah Anderson the next morning. "I need to ask you about the environmental contamination timeline. You mentioned that the damage accelerated in the past 5 years. That is correct. The engineering assessment shows significant spreading that appears to have begun around 2018. Sarah, David, and Stephanie moved into my farmhouse in 2019. They have been living there for 4 years, knowing about the contamination issues." There was a pause. "What exactly are you suggesting, Margaret?" "I am suggesting that they didn't just know about the environmental problems they may have caused them to worsen deliberately." I explained what I had remembered during sleepless nights. The basement renovation project David had insisted on managing himself. The way he had dismissed my concerns about new cracks appearing in foundation walls. The mysterious plumbing issues that had required expensive repairs, I had been told, were too technical for me to understand. "He wasn't trying to improve the property," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "He was sabotaging it systematically, making the contamination worse, so the house would be worthless when they eventually stole it from me." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, what you are describing is criminal conspiracy, spanning multiple years. Environmental contamination fraud is a federal offense. Can we prove it? We can certainly try. If we can obtain contractor records, soil sample histories, and documentation of the work your son claimed to be doing." My hands were shaking, but not from fear this time, from righteous anger at the scope of their betrayal. "There is something else," I said. "The water damage I mentioned, David told me our insurance covered most of the repair costs, but I had to pay a $3,000 deductible. I gave him cash for it. Do you have records of that payment?" I found the notation in my checkbook register. I made the check out to Morrison Environmental Services because David said the insurance company required payment directly to the restoration contractor. Dead silence on the other end of the line. "Margaret, I need you to sit down." Morrison Environmental Services was incorporated in Delaware 4 years ago. The sole owner is listed as Stephanie Morrison, your daughter-in-law. The room tilted dangerously. They hadn't just robbed me once. They had been systematically defrauding me for years, creating fake companies and phantom emergencies to extract money while simultaneously destroying my property's value. How much money are we discussing in total? I will need to conduct a complete audit, but based on what you have described, we are potentially looking at tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges over 4 years. I thought about all the times David had called with urgent repair needs, all the cash I had provided without question because I trusted my son implicitly, all the times Stephanie had expressed such gratitude for my financial help while literally stealing from me. They had played an extraordinarily long game and an incredibly stupid one, because now we had documentary evidence spanning years. This changes everything, I said, more to myself than to Sarah. It absolutely does. We are no longer discussing simple theft. This is organized, long-term elder abuse and fraud. The federal charges we can file now are much more serious than anything they are facing in Portugal. That afternoon, Sarah and I met with Detective Rodriguez again, this time with a comprehensive file of evidence documenting years of systematic financial abuse. The detective's expression grew increasingly grim as we presented our timeline and documentation. This is one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I have encountered, he said finally. We are not dealing with desperate people making impulsive bad decisions. This is organized criminal activity conducted over years. What does this mean for the Portuguese situation? Sarah asked. It means we are requesting immediate extradition for federal prosecution. The charges we can file here carry much more serious penalties than anything they are facing abroad. He turned to me with a grave expression. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to understand the implications. If we pursue federal charges, your son could be looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison. Your daughter-in-law faces similar exposure. This isn't a minor financial disagreement anymore. These are serious federal crimes with substantial mandatory minimum sentences. The weight of it settled over me like a heavy blanket. David, my little boy, could spend the next decade and a half of his life in federal prison. Madison and Tyler would grow up with their father behind bars, their mother imprisoned for financial crimes. What about my grandchildren? I asked quietly. Portuguese Child Services is already involved due to the arrests. The children are currently placed with a foster family approved by the American Embassy. If their parents are extradited and convicted here, custody becomes a much more complex issue. The detective didn't need to complete that thought. Emma and Tyler would become casualties of their parents' greed and criminal behavior. That night, I sat alone in my institutional apartment, staring at Robert's photograph and trying to imagine what he would counsel in this situation. He had always been protective of David, perhaps overly so, but he would also believed firmly in accountability and consequences. What should I do? I asked his smiling image. They systematically destroyed my life, but they are still my family in some sense. The silence felt heavier than usual. I was still awake when my phone rang at midnight, an international number I almost ignored. Mother? David's voice was barely audible, strained and desperate in a way that transported me back to his childhood nightmares. David, mother, please, I know what you must think of me, but I need you to listen carefully. I am listening. The lawyers here say you are refusing the settlement agreement. They say you are pursuing federal extradition. Mother, please, Madison and Tyler are terrified. They don't understand what is happening to their world. I closed my eyes, envisioning my grandchildren's confused faces. Perhaps you should have considered that before you decided to systematically rob your own mother. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We were planning to pay you back, I swear. We just needed to establish ourselves in Portugal first, and then we were going to ensure you were properly taken care of. With what money, David? The money you stole from me systematically over 4 years. 4 years, mother. What are you talking about? The manipulation was so blatant, it made me physically sick. Even now, facing serious federal charges, he was still attempting to gaslight me. Morrison Environmental Services ring any bells? The fake water damage, the deliberate environmental contamination. I know everything, David. Silence. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, completely harder, more calculating, reminding me uncomfortably of Stephanie. You cannot prove any of that, actually. I can. And I will. You are really going to destroy your own family over money? The question hung between us, carrying the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made for him. Every time I had prioritized his needs above my own. You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was worth more to you as a victim than as a mother, I said quietly. The moment you decided your own mother was nothing more than a bank account to be systematically emptied. Mother, I am not your mother anymore, David. Mothers protect their children from harm. They don't spend years planning to rob them and leave them homeless. I disconnected the call before he could respond. The next morning, I called Sarah Anderson with my final decision. I am not signing any settlement agreement. File whatever federal charges are appropriate. Are you absolutely certain? Once we initiate federal prosecution, there is no possibility of reversal. I thought about Stephanie's cruel note, about the years of fake emergencies and manufactured crises, about the cold calculation behind every interaction they had had with me. I am certain, and I want something else. What is that? I want to testify. I want their crimes on public record. I want other elderly people to understand how sophisticated these schemes can be, so they can protect themselves from similar predators. Sarah was quiet for a moment. That means no non-disclosure agreement. No protection of their privacy. Full public exposure of everything they did. Exactly. As I ended the call, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness exactly, but something close to peace. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't running from the truth or attempting to protect people who had never deserved my protection. David and Stephanie had made their choices over years of calculated criminal behavior. Now they would face the full consequences of those choices, and so would I. But for the first time in months, those consequences felt like justice rather than punishment. 2 years later, I stood in my kitchen watching sunrise paint, the mountains gold through windows that overlooked my own land once again. The house was smaller than my original farmhouse, a comfortable 2-bedroom cottage with a manageable garden. But it was mine, purchased with money recovered through federal prosecution, plus substantial damages awarded for systematic elder abuse. The morning news played softly on the small television mounted under my cabinets. I wasn't really listening until the anchor mentioned federal sentencing and financial crimes. I turned up the volume just in time to hear the conclusion of a story about American citizens convicted of elder abuse and environmental fraud. David had received 12 years in federal prison. Stephanie got 8 years. Their assets, including Portuguese property purchased with stolen money, had been seized and liquidated to pay restitution to their victim. I should have felt vindicated. Justice had been served comprehensively. The criminals punished appropriately, the victim compensated fairly. But mostly what I felt was tired. The most difficult part hadn't been testifying against them during the federal trial. It hadn't even been seeing David in prison clothes during sentencing, looking like a stranger wearing my son's face. The hardest part had been the phone call from Madison 6 months after their parents' conviction. Grandma Margaret. This is Madison. I am calling from my foster home here in Vermont. My heart had nearly stopped. My granddaughter, now 10 years old, calling from a placement facility just 2 hours from my new home. Madison, sweetheart. How are you? How is Tyler? We are okay. The foster family is really nice, and they are helping us understand what happened with Mom and Dad. The pause that followed carried the weight of unasked questions and confused loyalties. Grandma Margaret, I need to ask you something important. Did Mom and Dad really steal from you? I had closed my eyes, searching for age-appropriate words to explain the inexplicable to children who had lost everything. Yes, sweetheart, They took money that belonged to me, and they weren't honest about it. The social worker said, that is why they cannot come home for a very long time. She said they have to stay in prison because they broke important laws. That is correct. Another pause, longer this time. Are you angry at us for what they did? The question had shattered my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. Oh, honey, no. I could never be angry with you. What your parents did was their choice, not yours. Then why? Her voice had wavered. Why didn't you ask to take care of us? The lawyer said, you could have requested custody, and there was the question that haunted every quiet moment. The decision that made sleep elusive on too many nights. Madison, I wanted to take care of you both more than anything, but I am 73 years old now, and I was living in a tiny apartment with no money when your parents were arrested. I couldn't provide the stability you deserved. We wouldn't have minded being poor with you. The simplicity of her statement, the absolute trust it implied, had nearly destroyed my emotional control. I know, sweetheart, but sometimes love means wanting better for someone than what you can provide yourself. We had talked for over an hour that day. I had learned that the foster family was wonderful, experienced guardians who specialized in helping children navigate complex family situations. Madison was thriving academically. Tyler was excelling in youth soccer, and both were receiving counseling to process their parents' crimes. They were building resilient lives without me, without their parents, without any of the family structure they had been born into. I had maintained appropriate contact since then. Birthday gifts, holiday cards, occasional supervised visits when the social workers determined it was beneficial. But I hadn't seen them since the day they disappeared from my farmhouse, and I probably never would have a normal grandmother relationship with them. The financial recovery had been more complete than I had dared hope. The federal restitution, combined with civil damages for elder abuse, had restored not just my original losses, but provided additional compensation for emotional trauma and future security. I had established a small foundation to help other elderly victims of family financial abuse, not as large as some charities, but meaningful work that gave purpose to my experience. Sarah Anderson had been right about the public education value of my testimony. My case had been featured in national media coverage of elder abuse, and I had received hundreds of letters from people who had recognized similar warning signs in their own families. 3 years after the federal convictions, I received an unexpected communication. Madison, now 13, had written to ask if she could visit during summer break. The letter was mature, thoughtful, and heartbreaking in its careful consideration of everyone's feelings. Dear Grandma Margaret, I have been thinking about you a lot lately. My counselor says it might be good for me to understand more about what happened with my parents. And my foster mom says you are the only person who can explain it. Honestly, would it be okay if I came to see you? I don't want money or anything like that. I just want to understand my family better. I had called her foster mother immediately. The conversation had been cautious, but encouraging. Madison was doing exceptionally well, but she had questions about her family history that only I could answer appropriately. We arranged a day visit, supervised by social services. At my home, seeing Madison again after 3 years was simultaneously wonderful and heartbreaking. She had grown tall and serious, with David's dark hair but eyes that held wisdom no 13-year-old should possess. We had spent the afternoon in my garden, talking carefully about family, about choices, about the difference between loving someone and enabling their destructive behavior. I don't understand why they did it, she had said finally. Why would they hurt you when you loved them so much? Sometimes people make choices that don't make sense to anyone else, I had replied. What is important is that you understand their choices don't define you. You get to decide who you become. She had nodded solemnly. The foster family says I am smart enough for college scholarships if I keep working hard. Your parents' mistakes don't have to limit your future in any way. As she had prepared to leave that evening, Madison had hugged me tightly. I am proud of you for standing up to them, she had whispered. My counselor says you taught them that actions have consequences. Maybe that is why I am not afraid of people anymore. 6 months later, Tyler had requested his own visit. The conversation with my grandson had been different, but equally meaningful, focused more on forgiveness and moving forward than on understanding the past. Both children were thriving in ways that might not have been possible if they had remained with parents who had demonstrated such fundamental dishonesty and disrespect for others. That realization didn't eliminate my regrets, but it provided a measure of peace I hadn't expected to find. Now, 4 years after David and Stephanie's federal conviction, I maintained a careful but genuine relationship with both grandchildren. They visited occasionally, we exchanged letters regularly, and I had established college funds that would ensure their parents' crimes didn't limit their educational opportunities. The foundation I had established had helped more than 200 families navigate financial abuse situations, providing legal resources and emotional support for elderly victims of family exploitation. The work reminded me daily that my experience hadn't been unique, but my response to it had been unusually effective. Many victims never recovered financially or emotionally from family betrayal. Some remained trapped in abusive situations because they feared the consequences of resistance. My decision to fight back had not only restored my own life, but created resources for others facing similar challenges. On quiet evenings, I sat in my garden watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this place of hard-won independence. David and Stephanie had intended to destroy me, to reduce me to nothing more than a source of money and shelter. They would nearly succeeded in that goal. But I was still here, battered by the experience certainly, but not broken, changed by trauma, but not destroyed by it. And that, I would come to understand, represented the most complete victory possible. Tomorrow, Madison would call with updates about her freshman year in high school. Tyler would share stories about his basketball team. Both would continue building lives of integrity, despite their parents' legacy of deception. I would continue my foundation work, helping other elderly people recognize and resist financial predators who often wore the faces of family members. The cycle of healing and education would continue, growing stronger with each person who chose courage over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. I turned off the porch lights and prepared for bed in my own house, surrounded by the earned silence of a life that belonged entirely to me once again. For the first time in years, I fell asleep smiling, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others find their own paths to freedom and justice. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever experienced betrayal by people you trusted completely? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me which state you are watching from, so I can see how far this story of survival and justice has reached.